Good evening, I'm Roger Grimsby. Here now the news. Tonight we begin with the killing of a man who became a legend in his own time, John Lennon, shot down in cold blood.
And I heard 5-6 shots, and that was it.
There's blood all over his stomach.
Immediately get over to the Dakota.
It was John Lennon who was shot.
Gunshot, and these people come running in carrying a body.
There was a scream, a woman's voice.
Tell me he's alive. Tell me he's alive.
The story was that John Lennon was shot.
Who would do such a thing and why?
He was dead on arrival.
He's such a peaceful man.
My God, this is an icon.
We'll have team coverage of the story of John Lennon's murder.
I was watching the football game when I heard Cosell say,
"An unspeakable tragedy. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival."
Hi everyone, I'm Bill Ritter. John Lennon, whose music and dreams of peace inspired the world, cut down right here, December 8th, 1980, 40 years ago. It happened right in front of the building where he lived, with his family, Yoko Ono, and their young son, Sean, a man who preached peace in his songs and in his life, ends up being killed in the violent horror of senseless gunfire. Outside the sprawling and iconic Dakota apartment building, 72nd and Central Park West in New York City. The killer, a young man named Mark David Chapman, who actually posed for pictures with Lennon earlier in the day he was killed. Chapman was a religious fanatic who saw in the book Catcher in the Rye a character to identify with, a young man who despised phonies. And Chapman thought Lennon was a phony. But John Lennon was the real deal. Lennon moved to New York in 1971 to get away from the limelight, to get away from the paparazzi of England. And he was quickly adopted by New Yorkers. And you can tell how much he loved this city by the song he wrote about it. New York City! He loved it here, a kind of rough and tumble water city, like his hometown of Liverpool, but much bigger, where he could be just John, not one of the Beatles, the biggest rock band of all time.
I grew up with the Beatles. I came of age with the Beatles. They were not only the most influential music group of the time, and possibly of all time, they were the most influential group in my life. I liked their music, I liked their messages, and I particularly liked John, and I liked what John stood for. I felt that he was more than just a performer. He used his celebrity status to do good, and I thought that was terrific.
To be out of New York is to be out of town.
Lennon embraced his life here in New York, and New York embraced him.
John Lennon and Yoko meant so much to New York, especially to the West Side. They were actually made for this city, and they were here was a value that so many people saw. And they also were neighbors. They were there. They were out around, and people would see them, and they would talk to people, and they were just a valued member of the community.
I certainly didn't want to be intrusive to John Lennon and Yoko. We waved. And I thought it was cool.
They were such fixtures, they were so friendly, so open. They defined the ethos of New York in many ways. They adopted it so thoroughly.
John was getting accustomed to life off the stage, but his murder would put him center stage once again. What you're about to see is a different kind of New York story. It's also an Eyewitness News story because WABC-TV Channel 7 and ABC News broke the tragic news about John Lennon to the country, broke it to the world. And the people you're about to meet, journalists who were there.
The fans gathered here tonight who knew John Lennon through his music, through his songs, through his verses.
This is a neighbor. He's in the neighborhood here. I couldn't believe it.
Ernie? Thank you, John. After John Lennon's murder...
I just missed him. I just missed him. I left around 10 o'clock and walked back to the studio. And when I found out later what had happened, I said, was Chapman there? Did I see him?
Everybody knew John. Everybody in New York knew John and Yoko. They had settled, they had made New York their home.
And you'll also hear this story from the Eyewitness News producer who, by chance, was in the emergency room that night when they wheeled John Lennon in and tried desperately to bring him back to life.
I watched them working on John Lennon. One particular doctor had his hands inside Lennon's chest, and I can see that he was pumping, and blood everywhere.
It was not supposed to be like this for John Lennon, the complicated, passionate, sarcastic, and oh so talented leader of the Beatles. On his own for years, he had been kind of reborn, personally and professionally. He was finally emerging from a kind of emotional abyss and a very rough patch in his marriage, to put it mildly. He had a young son, a new album, a kind of new life, like starting over for John Lennon.
Just like starting over.
Having just seen that and just seeing John so happy, the Double Fantasy album had come out. He and Yoko had reconciled after a rocky period. They had the baby. Everything was perfect.
But on the night of December 8th, it was about to come to an end, all of it, because of this man, Mark David Chapman, 25 years old, a native of Georgia but living in Hawaii, who was stalking John Lennon, and he wanted to kill him. While Chapman was waiting outside the Dakota that night of December 8th, a man he wouldn't have possibly known was also there. A man known to most New Yorkers as the 11 o'clock anchor of Eyewitness News, Ernie Anastos.
This is Eyewitness News with Ernie Anastos.
He was showing an out-of-town friend the building where John Lennon and his wife Yoko lived.
And I'm standing there with my friend, same generation, and I said, you know who lives here? He said, no, John Lennon.
That night?
That night. He said, John Lennon. I said, yeah, he lives here. And we're standing by the great archway. And I said, you know what? I said, he's a fabulous guy. I said, he's living in our neighborhood. People come by here many times. I said, they even get autographs from him. He said, you think he'll come by tonight? I said, he's a wonderful guy. I said, he loves New York, came here in '71. He lived down, in the Village for a while. He lived at the St. Regis Hotel. Then he moved up here to the Dakota, which is a beautiful building. I said, and this is what he calls home. He said, do you think he'll show up? I said, you never know. We'll stay here a few more minutes. But I said, he could. And we left. And I went back to the studio.
Not long afterwards, John and Yoko returned from the music studio where they had been recording. They walked back by the crowd, and by then, Mark David Chapman was no longer interested in pictures or autographs. He wanted blood.
I had earlier heard shots in Central Park, but Bill, in 1980, hearing shots in Central Park wasn't that unusual, so I just dismissed it.
I was at a party at the Tavern on the Green. It was an after party for a movie called Stir Crazy, I remember. And I noticed a lot of activity or conversation going on at the entrance to the place. And I went over, and people just arriving, had gone past the Dakota, and they said there's a lot of activity there.
By that time, our newsroom had heard about the shots, and we sent a couple of photographers to the Dakota, including Len Trudman.
I was called from the assignment desk, and they said, immediately get over to the Dakota because there's been a shooting, and they mentioned John Lennon. I said, what? I couldn't believe it. So I was parked on 66th Street. I went around Columbus, shot right up 72nd Street, ended up directly across the street from the Dakota entrance. We got there before the cops sealed the area, and I was sealed in, and unfortunately, no other crew was able to get near it. First thing I did is make sure we got a live transmission out. So up went the 60-foot rods, made sure we made contact. I put the camera on the roof to shoot what I can. Then one of my partners came down, and he started shooting from the ground level, but they wouldn't let him walk across the street, obviously. And then Doug showed up. It was a relief because he really took charge.
I wasn't the first person to arrive, but I was fairly early to get there. In fact, by the time I got there, I think John Lennon had died, and Chapman, I think, had already been arrested. But there was a large crowd gathering, and the crowd was interesting. They weren't a noisy crowd at all. They were stunned. That was no other word to describe it.
For a long time, the crowd just stood silently by. By 2 a.m., there were about 400 or 500 people outside the Dakota.
Very sad thing that happened, and I hope the people will realize that there's a lot of love that was felt for John Lennon.
After a long time of silence, the crowd began to sing. First John's song about give peace a chance.
How late did you stay there? What happened throughout the night there?
Oh, I was there for a long time as the crowd kept coming and coming and coming, and then eventually the word got out that John Lennon was dead. I don't know. You can't imagine what it was like, Bill, that night. You can't imagine what it was like. And then John died, and one cop said that all he said was I shot. That's all he said.
When we come back, the Eyewitness News producer, the first to confirm John Lennon was dead because he saw the former Beatle brought into the emergency room.
I think that there are certain seminal moments in our lives that are etched in our memory with acid.
Alan Weiss, the producer of the 6 p.m. newscast at Eyewitness News, just happened to be in the hospital emergency room after a traffic accident on that December 8, 1980. And what Alan Weiss saw that fateful night would change the world.
I watched them working on John Lennon.
That's what Weiss saw in the ER at the old Roosevelt Hospital on the west side of Manhattan when they wheeled in a mortally wounded John Lennon, shot several times in the back.
I was hit by a taxi. I was on a motorcycle, I was riding in Central Park, and this taxi cut me off, hit me, and I was rushed to the ER.
But you suddenly became mobile when you saw what?
Adrenaline's an amazing drug, I gotta tell you, because I'm lying on a gurney in the ER, in the hallway of the ER, and the doctor's looking at me, and she's looking at my hip where I had landed, and she's talking about getting me to X-ray. And literally, as she's saying that, the person in the back of the, behind me, so the back of my head is facing the entrance to the ER, yells, "We have a gunshot, gunshot." And the doctors are the ones that are coming in, hitting the door right now. And the doors open up, and these people come running in, carrying a body between them, and literally take this person into the room that I am lying outside of. And the doctor said to me, "Alan, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to take care of this. I'll be back when I can." And I said, "I understand, Doc." So I'm lying there, my eyes are closed, and the two officers are standing literally behind me, where I'm lying down, and one says to the other, "Can you believe it? John Lennon." And I opened my eyes, and I looked up and said, "Excuse me, officer, what did you just say?" And he looked at me, and I looked like something dragged in by the cat. I had leaves, I had dirt, I had, a black leather jacket on, and he looked at me and says, "I didn't say anything," and he moved away. So I'm lying there and saying, did I really hear this correctly? Am I somewhat befuddled because of the accident? And I hear crying, and I'm able to twist around, and I see an Asian woman in a fur coat being brought in on the arms of a police officer. Now, I know who Yoko Ono was, but I wasn't particularly familiar enough that I could spot her facial features from 20 feet away, particularly upside down because I'm looking behind me.
You had just been in an accident.
And I also just been in an accident. But that made it really pretty clear that this very possibly could be John Lennon. And I realized that I have to get to a phone. And I knew from being at this hospital before, not that I'm accident prone, but I've been here a couple of times, that there was a phone right outside the emergency room door.
A payphone.
Payphone. So I got out of my gurney, and this is where the adrenaline kicks in, because I was feeling no pain. And I was able to work my way down the line of gurneys that were empty along the wall and got all the way to the end of the hallway. And there's the payphone. And I had my hand on the doorknob, and at that moment, the police officer who had brought me in, one of the police officers who had brought me in, comes running down the hallway saying, "Mr. Weiss, what are you doing standing up? You gotta take the stretcher apart to bring you in. What are you doing standing up?" And I said to him, "Well, didn't you hear?" He goes, "Didn't I hear what?" I said, "John Lennon's been shot." And he said, "Who told you that?" I said, "You didn't hear that?" He says, "Alan, if John Lennon had been shot, I would have heard it on my radio." He pointed to his mic. He said, "Come on, let me take you back to the bed." I said, "All right." And I'm hopping back, and we passed the nursing stand. I said to the police officer, "Can I just make a phone call?" So he leans over the desk, because we're at the nursing station. He gives me the phone. He punches in the code to dial out. I call Neil Goldstein, the assignment editor for the 11 o'clock news. I say, "Neil, I'm in the hospital. I think John Lennon's been shot." And Neil says, "I just heard a call for an ambulance to go to 72nd and Central Park West, the Dakota area." I said, "Neil, it's got to be John Lennon. Get here right away." So after I made the phone call, I went back and sat on the edge of the gurney. And I watched them working on John Lennon. And one particular doctor had his hands inside Lennon's chest. And I can see that he was pumping, and blood everywhere. And I'm watching this scene. It's incredible that any human being is undergoing this, but let alone, John Lennon. It's just inconceivable. This is John Lennon. And they put me in a separate room. And so I'm now in the hospital. I'm not in the emergency room. And I'm there, and about 5 or 10 minutes later, maybe about quarter after 11, in the hospital, they play Muzak. You don't hear it in the ER, but you hear it in the hospital. And the song that comes up on the hospital's Muzak is All My Loving. The song ends, and about 60 seconds later, there's a high, shrill woman's voice screaming, "No, no, oh no, oh no." And then about less than a minute after that, the door opens, and Yoko comes out, I believe on the arms of David Geffen. So after that, the doctor comes, the original female doctor who was looking at me when I first came in, now comes into the room. She says, "All right, Mr. Weiss, now let's take a look at your leg." I said, "Wait, Doc, hold on a second. What's the story with John Lennon?" She said, "There's going to be a press conference in 30, 40 minutes. I said, "Okay, what's the story with John Lennon?" She said, "I can't tell you." I said, "Doc, please. I mean, I've seen the man come in. I've seen what's going on. You got to tell me, what is the story?" She says, I can't tell you." I said, "Okay, let me ask you a question, doctor. Are you one of the main doctors here right now?" "Yes." "If someone were brought in with a gunshot in their chest and their chest was opened and they were still alive, would your presence still be required in that situation?" "Yes, it would be." I said, "Thank you, doctor. So now I know he's dead. I got to make a phone call." She says, "You can't make a phone call." I said, "Doc, there's a phone right over there. I can't let you get off the bed. You can sue for malpractice. Who knows what damage you'll do to your hip." And I said, "Did you always want to be a doctor?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I always wanted to be a journalist." "Did you always want to be a good doctor?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I always wanted to be a good journalist." I said, "Letting me get to that phone and letting me do my job is as important to me as you being able to rescue someone's life would be important to you. Can I please make a phone call?" And she said, "Sorry, I cannot let you get out of bed, but I am going to go and check and see if the x-ray is ready for you, and you need a special code for that phone anyway, which I'm not going to tell you is 117. So I'm going to be back in about 15 minutes, and I'm sure you'll be in your bed when I come back." I said, "Of course I will, Doc." This wasn't just simply someone who was shot. This is somebody that was a legend, was a cultural icon, was almost a force of nature.
Eyewitness News, thanks to Alan Weiss, had confirmed John Lennon was dead, but how to break the news? As it happened, much of the country that night was watching ABC and Monday Night Football, and the big game was about to become much bigger, breaking the news of John Lennon's murder during a football game. People near the Dakota knew John Lennon had been shot and was likely dead. But remember, this was before breaking news alerts on your phone, before social media, before email was a thing. And because our producer Alan Weiss was in the ER and saw Lennon dead,
One cop turned to the cop and said, "It's John Lennon."
we were the only ones who could confirm what really happened. But how best and how quickly to tell New York and tell the world?
Hello again, everyone, and we're excited about tonight.
As it happens, the biggest TV audience of the week was on WABC that night, Monday Night Football. And ABC had Howard Cosell,
You just can't come into a game the way New England has come into this.
the country's most famous sportscaster and a former Eyewitness News sports anchor. Cosell had interviewed John Lennon a few years before on Monday Night Football.
Want to move that up just a little closer?
How are you?
What's been your view of this American professional football scene?
It's an amazing event and sight. It makes rock concerts look like tea parties. But I must say, the first thing I heard when I got in was I'm playing a Beatles tune yesterday, which cheered me up no end.
We gave the story to ABC, to Howard and one of his football broadcasting partners, Frank Gifford, a former pro player. Listen carefully as Cosell and Gifford discuss off-air during a 1-minute commercial break how to handle, and even if whether they should handle, the Lennon assassination during a football game.
He was shot outside his apartment, the Dakota apartment building. Fellas, I just don't know. I'd like your opinion. I can't see this game situation allowing for that news flash. Can you?
Absolutely, I can see it.
You can?
You betcha. We've got to. If we know it, we've got to do it.
All right.
I don't hang on it. It's a tragic moment, and
All right.
this is going to shake up the whole world.
All right. I will get it in.
Frank Gifford absolutely made the right call, unquestionably. I'm surprised that Howard Cosell was reluctant to tell the story. He was, very much in the news. He's not just a sportscaster. And the magnitude of that story, how could you not tell that story?
Seconds later, Cosell broke the news about John Lennon. I, like millions of other Americans, remember it like it was yesterday, watching the game at home.
Line, Howard, you have got to say what we know in the booth.
Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. Hard to go back to the game after that news flash, which in duty bound we had to tell.
I was watching the football game at home, and when I heard, I think of Cosell say that John Lennon has been shot, it was just a second. Why would anybody shoot John Lennon?
Back inside the Eyewitness newsroom, Ernie Anastos, the anchor of the late-night newscast, was stunned by Lennon's death and stunned that he was there at the Dakota just before.
You just missed him. I just missed him. I left around 10 o'clock and walked back to the studio. And when I found out later what had happened, I said, was Chapman there? Did I see him? Did I not see what was going on? So what if I had stayed there? What if I had stayed there another half hour? There's a late football game on the air. I could have stayed a little longer, but I left. But I was right there on the spot where he was shot. And about an hour and a half, 2 hours later, I'm talking about his death.
Coming up next, with Howard Cosell telling the world John Lennon was dead. Now it was up to Eyewitness News to tell the story of what happened and why. Inside the scrambling Channel 7 newsroom 40 years ago, when we come back. Phone calls were coming into the newsroom from viewers who had heard the shots. And then there was Alan Weiss's eyewitness account. He saw John Lennon dead in the hospital.
There was a scream, a woman's voice. Oh no, no, oh no, no. It continued for about 2 or 3 minutes.
He saw Yoko Ono crying in the arms of David Geffen. The newsroom scrambling to get all the details ready for air.
We were in the newsroom and there was a buzz. something was going on. The assignment desk was busy, people were running around, phone calls were coming in, trying to get information. But we had heard that something had happened, and the story was that John Lennon was shot, which we couldn't believe. John Lennon shot? Where? What happened? When I heard the Dakota, Bill, you can imagine how I felt. I was there a couple of hours just before that. We had heard reports that were coming in, unconfirmed for a while. Alan Weiss, who was our producer, was at the hospital. What an amazing thing for him to be there, to witness history at a time like that. Incredible. Those events would be taking place all at the same time. So as the pieces were coming together, everybody is trying to figure out, how are we going to structure this? How are we going to put it on the air? And we finally came up with the format. Producers were working on it, assignment desk was part of it.
And so after Monday Night Football, after the world had been told about John Lennon's murder, Ernie and his co-anchor, Roseanne Scamardella, prepared their late-night newscast to fully report this ginormous story.
Former Beatle John Lennon is dead. He was shot a short time ago outside his Manhattan apartment building. He died at Roosevelt Hospital. Police have a suspect in custody.
Roseanne and I went into the studio, and we were sitting there waiting patiently to go on the air. Now, you know, in the studio, it's kind of quiet. People are just gathering their thoughts. I'm getting last-minute information in my ear, making a few notes and preparing. But the real frenetic scene is in the control room. And that's where the producers and everybody else, the director, people are just gathering all of this information.
We call it the out-of-control room.
It's the out-of-control room, exactly. You know, it gets wild in there. And if you've never seen that environment, I mean, it's really something to watch. But that particular night, you could feel a combination. People were tense, people were amazed by what was going on, people were nervous, and people were waiting to get on the air. That was the moment. The light went on. Roseanne made the announcement. We followed up with the stories that we had live from the scene.
We just came from a briefing with the head of the emergency department here, Dr. Lynn. He said that Lennon was shot or had maybe 7 wounds to his chest and stomach, and that he was dead certainly when he arrived here at the hospital. There were intense efforts to revive him, transfusion, resuscitation. It did not work.
And what was going through our heads? We were thinking, how could this have happened? How could we have witnessed something like this in our city? Why would anybody want to kill John Lennon? I can remember that we were sitting there, and at one point, I know her. She reached out and grabbed my hand. Under the desk, she held my hand because she was nervous about what we were doing. She was passionate about what had happened. She couldn't believe it, and she had compassion for Yoko Ono and for other people who were feeling this loss, for Sean. And so it was a very, very emotional moment, to say the least. Here I am doing my job as a reporter, and at the same time, I'm thinking about John Lennon, the man, the guy that I followed, his music and his message. This was very personal for me. And to think that I would be on the air talking about his murder, talking about how he was shot.
5 blocks away.
5 blocks away. Can you imagine that? I said to myself, this is eerie. This is surreal that I'm really reporting this and talking about this, especially after I experienced being there a couple of hours before. When we were on the air that night, we were very careful because the information was coming in rapidly. There were reports coming in from the police. There were reports coming in from the scene. There were people on the street. They were looking for eyewitnesses to what was going on. We were just scrambling to get as much information, factual information, to put on the air. It was tense, to say the least. It was very personal in many ways, as I pointed out, because this is somebody that was part of our neighborhood and also part of our lives. But I think we were trying to be as professional as we could be. And we didn't know what was going to happen next. We had no idea what the next piece to this story would be, how it would unfold while we were on the air that night.
Up next came Nightline, and one of John Lennon's good friends, former Eyewitness News reporter Geraldo Rivera, was shell-shocked.
It was almost as if a relative of mine had been slain.
Straight ahead, Geraldo talks about his pal and the wounds that have never healed. After Eyewitness News came Nightline and former Channel 7 reporter Geraldo Rivera. who had become good friends with Lennon in the 1970s.
I got a call from the Nightline producer. It said, did you hear your buddy has been killed? And I said, my buddy? And they said, John Lennon. And I swear, I almost passed out, my knees buckled. And they said, you have to come on Nightline. It was one of the most shockingly personal acts of violence in my life. It was just horrifying, and having just seen them.
Geraldo Rivera, who has covered John Lennon both as a personality and an artist.
And what did you say that night to Ted Koppel?
Well, you know, it was, I tried to maintain my composure. It was very difficult. I remember saying something like, I'm
trying to put my thoughts in order and give them to you in a logical way, but the painful aspect of what's happened has really skewed my reasoning.
Well, let's just stop for one moment.
Ted Koppel kind of walked me through our relationship, the relationship I had with John and Yoko. It was just trying to keep focused and be a newsman. At the same time, I was as anguished as anyone in the world. It was Bill, you remember what a blow it was to everybody. Everybody was staggering.
No one walked the fine line more delicately between friend, fan, and journalist than Geraldo Rivera, the former Eyewitness news reporter who would later work for Good Morning America and 2020 before becoming just Geraldo.
So it was such a personal act of violence. It was almost as if a relative of mine had been slain. The fact that he was cut down by some schmuck with no real reason other than a Catcher in the Rye or the book or something that upset him about John's lifestyle. There was no real reason for this guy Chapman from Hawaii to come and stalk John and then to earlier get John to sign his album, to sign the Double Fantasy album. It was just so pathetic, so shocking. It was such a waste.
This is Eyewitness News.
John Lennon's death was apparently planned well in advance. Police say suspect Mark Chapman borrowed a substantial amount of money to fly from his home in Hawaii to New York to shoot Lennon. John Johnson has more on the man accused.
Police speculate that Chapman arrived in New York last week. He had begun to stalk Lennon from his room here at the West 63rd Street Y, outside the wrought iron gates of the Dakota. Lennon gives Chapman an autograph at 5 p.m. as he leaves for a recording session. When Lennon returns, about 11 that night, Chapman is waiting with his .38. The hunt is over.
He was enraged at Lennon because Lennon had said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. And reportedly, he had become so angered at that Lennon had committed blasphemy, and as born-again Christian, he went out to correct what he saw as this blasphemous, evil, and wrong.
Well, now, as you've already heard, Mark David Chapman came to New York with the express purpose of killing John Lennon, even though he was reportedly a John Lennon fan. Now, Chapman also has a history of mental problems. He was institutionalized on 2 previous occasions when he tried to take his own life. One of those attempts on his own life came in an earlier visit right here to New York City. Well, he was unsuccessful. He came back with his gun and he killed a genius.
He came on December 6th, December 7th, December 8th, and then come to the Dakota and hang out there. And then after having John Lennon signed an autograph for him, wait until that evening when Lennon and Yoko are coming back from doing a recording session and shoot John Lennon 4 times in the back. And some psychiatrist at the time had said this was in a way a reverse suicide. And Chapman had evidently and reportedly had tried to kill himself previously and had said that he identified so with John Lennon that he thought he was John Lennon, and so that when he killed John Lennon, he was actually killing himself.
In the next week, psychiatrists must decide if Chapman is fit to stand trial. Friends say he wasn't a violent man. Chapman's wife says only that she's sorry for Lennon's family.
I'm just still, again, very concerned about Mark, and I'm just very, very sorry that this had to happen to Yoko Ono and her family, and that her husband had to die.
1 week after John Lennon was murdered, a massive outpouring of emotion and tribute. around the world and in New York. When we come back, the day more than 200,000 people gathered in Central Park, singing, and then silence. The Sunday after John Lennon died, Yoko had called for 10 minutes of silence worldwide to honor her husband. Other cities took that as a cue to gather and listen to Lennon's music, including in New York's Central Park. More than 200,000 people, all of them wanting to give, it seemed, peace a chance. There was lots of Lennon music, and then for 10 minutes, silence.
When I looked at all the people there, they were of all races, creeds, colors, age. They were all mourning. And then I thought the words of John Lennon, which still live on, you say that I'm a dreamer and I'm not the only one. Hopefully you will join us, and together someday we will be the world as one. Why would somebody just want to hold that near and dear?
It was a cold day. Skies were gray.
It's December in New York.
It's December, it's winter. And I get to the park, and we're going to go on the air and do a live broadcast. And I look at this mass of people, a sea of people. There were 225,000 people there that day. And I walked into the park and I'm looking around at faces, and I could see children's faces. I could see people with their kids, John Lennon t-shirts, buttons on their coats, flowers. Somebody gave me a flower and said, put this on your microphone. Candles. Everybody was just looking at one another. It was a strange feeling, and the music through the loudspeakers was John Lennon's voice, and I could hear it. Imagine. His voice was ringing in the air, and people were looking at it, their eyes crying. And I would ask some people, tell me something. I think I know.
Why are you here? A very simple response. They said, you know.
You know why. You didn't have to say anything. There were policemen standing around doing their job, but you could tell that this was part of one big family. We were in mourning together. 2 o'clock comes along. I'm on the staging, and it's time for this silent vigil, this silent tribute. All of a sudden, everything went off. The music stopped. I could faintly hear a police helicopter up above. No horns, no cars, not even a dog barking in New York City. It was silent. And we all kind of just looked around at one another and knew that we all had our own personal thoughts and feelings about it. I have to tell you something, I had never experienced anything like that in my life.
You are known for looking right at someone and making eye contact when you talk. You didn't then, did you? I felt like you brought yourself back there just now.
I was there. When I was telling you that story, I was looking off because I could see and feel what was going on that day. I felt it. You know, you don't forget something like that. You don't forget it because it's part of your own personal history as well as doing your job.
You have to live for today, just like that song. Imagine all the people living for today. Now, you don't have to think about the past and you don't think about the future. You live today.
The crowd had gathered to pay a final tribute to John Lennon. Clearly, the crowd was moved by the ceremony. Some wept openly. Some chanted, "Give peace a chance." But ironically, there was a gunman in the crowd, and before the crowd dispersed, a man was shot.
I don't believe that this guy comes to a John Lennon vigil, you know, a man who stood for peace and love and everything, carrying a gun, looking for trouble.
John Lennon's ashes will be buried tomorrow in a secret location. After his body was cremated yesterday in Hartsdale, the ashes were given to Yoko Ono.
We wanted very much to talk to Yoko Ono on this 40th anniversary. She has, after all, carried the torch of her husband's legacy, speaking out against injustice, about gun violence, and building strawberry fields in Central Park across the street from the apartment where he was killed and where she still lives today. But she didn't want to talk about that day 40 years ago.
I think that Yoko Ono, in my humble, modest opinion, doesn't want to undermine his memory or his words by saying more than what she has said. And that being that she has said that his words will live forever. And that is enough to say, other than that he represented love. And love. Gee, what more is needed?
And remember photojournalist Len Trugman, the first cameraman on the scene that night. Turns out Len wrote on pieces of paper his assignments for each day he worked over a period of decades, including his log for December 8th, 1980.
December 8th, 1980, worked from 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. John Lennon, 40 years old. Doug Johnson was the reporter, producer was Alan Weiss, the desk was Neil Goldstein. We were the first crew on the scene, and we parked on 72nd Street in Central Park West and let the desk know immediately where we were and where we set up. We were there all night. They brought me gas and food and kept feeding gas into the generator. You know, what's good about this piece, I used it for a bookmark for years. You know? It was a big story.
A bookmark to an incredible chapter. There's a great song at the end of the Broadway musical Hamilton. It goes, "Who lives, who dies, who gets to tell your story?" I thought of that song as we reported this story.
He was one of us, and he's dead. His music made our good times better. His music made our bad times at least livable. And in the back of all our minds was the hope that one day they'd get together again. We'd all feel the harmony. We'd be able to give a flower to a stranger and not feel foolish. And now he's dead. If he hadn't dreamed so beautifully, it wouldn't hurt so much.
I'm 77 years old now, and I think of John, who's been 80 years old. 40 years worth of music we lost because of this act of violence, this senseless, brutal act of violence. It's nonsensical.
You look back on it 40 years later and you say, what have we learned? Have we grown from this? There have been more shootings, senseless acts of violence. And you keep saying to yourself, this is the last time. This is the last time. And it isn't the last time. But I think his message, resonates even today. And what is he telling us? Give peace a chance.
Lennon's music, of course, lives on, but how his amazing and so young life ended so quickly, well, that's part of his story, too. Part of his legacy as well, because it brought New York together, brought the world together, to imagine a place without gun violence. We could all tell John Lennon's story every day, a little bit at a time, if we choose to. We tried to do that with the story you've just seen. I'm Bill Ritter, and for all of us here, as John Lennon would say, peace and love.